Imagine a world where businesses are held accountable for their entire supply chain. The EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, is set to revolutionize global business practices, ensuring companies prioritize human rights and environmental impacts. Let's take a closer look at what the CSDDD is and why it matters. First, the directive introduces mandatory due diligence. This means companies are now legally required to identify, prevent, and address negative impacts on human rights and the environment across their own operations, subsidiaries, and supply chains. It specifically targets the entire chain of activities, from raw material sourcing to product distribution. However, it does not cover the consumer's use or disposal of products, which are addressed by other EU laws. So why was CSDDD introduced? It's a response to the failure of voluntary corporate responsibility. High-profile cases of labor abuse and environmental damage showed that self-regulation wasn't enough. The directive shifts those expectations into binding legal obligations. Importantly, CSDDD codifies global standards. Principles from the UN, OECD, ILO, and the Paris Agreement are now enforceable under EU law. This harmonization helps ensure consistent expectations across industries and borders. Finally, this move is driven by rising public and investor demand for greater accountability, especially on issues like child labor, deforestation, and carbon emissions. It's not just about compliance, it's about building trust and fairness in a sustainable global economy. Let's now look at when the CSDDD actually takes effect and how it applies to different companies. The directive was officially adopted in 2024, and all EU member states must transpose it into national law by July 26, 2026. After that, the rules will come into force gradually based on company size, giving businesses time to prepare. The first wave of compliance starts in July 2027, targeting the very largest companies. That means EU companies with 5,000 or more employees and at least 1.5 billion euros in global turnover. It also includes non-EU companies with over 1.5 billion euros in EU revenue. 1 year later, in July 2028, the scope expands to large companies with 3,000 or more employees and 900 million euros in turnover, either globally or within the EU, depending on where the company is based. Finally, by July 2029, the directive reaches its full scope. It will then apply to companies with at least 1,000 employees and 450 million euros in annual revenue. For non-EU companies, this threshold is based purely on EU turnover, not headcount. So, if a non-EU company generates over 450 million euros in EU sales, even with fewer than 1,000 employees in Europe, it will fall under the directive by 2029. Let's take a closer look at what companies are actually required to do under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. To comply, businesses need to embed a full due diligence cycle into their management systems, what's known as the Plan, Do, Check, Act approach. Let's walk through the core obligations step by step. First, companies must integrate due diligence into their corporate policies. This means taking a risk-based approach and embedding human rights and environmental standards into internal processes like procurement, CSR, and risk management. A solid supplier code of conduct is essential, and these policies should be overseen and regularly reviewed by senior leadership. Second, firms must identify and assess potential and actual adverse impacts. This involves mapping the value chain, especially high-risk sectors or regions, to locate where the most serious impacts might arise. Think of areas like conflict minerals or high-risk manufacturing hubs. Companies should prioritize these risks based on severity and likelihood, using tools like human rights and environmental impact assessments. Third, companies are expected to take action to prevent or mitigate those impacts. That could involve developing corrective action plans for suppliers, investing in cleaner production technologies, or even changing sourcing decisions. Where issues can't be fixed immediately, a remediation plan must be drawn up, tackling the most serious problems first. And yes, if a partner refuses to fix major issues, like child labor, business ties may need to be suspended or ended entirely. Fourth, if harm has already occurred, companies must provide remediation. This could mean compensating affected workers or communities or restoring environmental damage. And it's not just good practice, it's a legal obligation. Victims must be given access to justice, and companies may be held liable if due diligence was neglected. Fifth, The CSDD emphasizes meaningful stakeholder engagement. That means actively involving workers, communities, and NGOs when identifying risks and developing solutions. For instance, a company sourcing minerals might consult with local groups or civil society experts to better understand impacts on the ground. Let's move into the operational side of compliance. The concrete systems companies must now put in place. First, companies are required to set up a grievance mechanism or complaints procedure. This must be accessible to any stakeholder, whether workers, NGOs, or community members. Think of it as a hotline or platform where concerns can be raised about human rights or environmental issues in the company's operations or supply chain. Second, companies must implement monitoring and periodic review of their due diligence system. This isn't a one-off checklist. The directive views due diligence as a continuous improvement loop. That means regular audits, on-site inspections, and performance tracking. Third, firms are now required to publicly communicate their due diligence work. This includes publishing an annual due diligence statement outlining identified risks and actions taken. This reporting ties in with CSRD obligations and ensures transparency for investors and consumers. Fourth, the directive goes further by linking due diligence to climate action. Certain companies must adopt a climate transition plan aligned with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius target. That means setting science-based emission goals, improving energy efficiency, and shifting to renewables. Finally, for non-EU companies, there's a structural requirement. They must appoint an authorized representative within the EU. This person acts as the contact point for regulators and stakeholders. If a company doesn't already have an EU branch, it will need to designate someone, a distributor, a legal agent, or open a new office to ensure compliance. To sum up, the CSDDD requires companies to run a full-spectrum due diligence system, from risk analysis to public reporting, from climate planning to legal accountability. The EU sustainability landscape includes several major regulations, and it's easy to mix them up. In this section, we'll clarify how the CSDD fits in and how it relates to three key initiatives: EPR, which deals with product end of life, CSRD, which focuses on reporting, and ESPR, which targets sustainable product design. Together, they form a connected framework for responsible business. Let's start by looking at Extended Producer Responsibility, or EPR, and how it compares to the CSDDD. First, EPR is all about what happens after a product is sold. It places responsibility on producers to ensure proper collection, recycling, or disposal of their products and packaging, especially for things like electronics and batteries. In contrast, CSDDD focuses on earlier stages, covering human rights and environmental risks during sourcing, design, and production. The two frameworks apply to different stages of the product lifecycle. EPR looks at post-consumer waste, while CSDDD looks at corporate conduct and supply chains. Legally, these are separate obligations. Following one doesn't fulfill the requirements of the other. That said, they share complementary goals. Both aim to reduce the overall environmental footprint of products. There are also strategic benefits to aligning efforts, such as designing products for recyclability, which supports both environmental due diligence under CSDDD and cost-effective recycling under EPR. Finally, while they work toward a common sustainability vision, their focus areas remain distinct. EPR deals with end-of-life product impact, while CSDDD addresses the ethical and environmental impact of how products are made. Now that we've covered what companies are required to do under EPR, let's turn to what they're required to communicate. And that's where the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, comes in. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, came into effect in 2023, and it marks a major expansion in sustainability reporting requirements for companies operating in Europe. Its goal is simple: transparency. It ensures companies disclose how they perform on ESG issues, including both their risks and impacts. Who does it apply to? Initially, the largest EU companies, including listed firms, and eventually non-EU companies with over 150 million euros in EU turnover. The rollout is phased. The biggest players start reporting in 2025 based on 2024 data, with smaller entities following by 2026 through 2028. So how does CSRD connect to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD? Here's the key point. CSRD is about transparency. CSDDD is about action. In other words, the CSDDD makes companies do due diligence, identify and address sustainability risks in their operations and supply chains. Meanwhile, the CSRD makes many of those same companies report what they're doing and what outcomes they've achieved. For a company, assuming it eventually falls under CSRD, the public reporting it does could also fulfill its CSDDD communication obligations. One report, 2 boxes checked. The important distinction is, CSRD requires disclosure. Even if there are problems, you just need to report them. CSDDD requires action. You must actually address the issues. In practice, companies should implement both in tandem. Preparing early for CSDDD will make CSRD reporting smoother, and robust CSRD reports will help demonstrate compliance with CSDDD. Regulators will expect consistency. If you're reporting strong due diligence, you better be doing it. In short, CSRD and CSDDD are complementary, not overlapping, and together they push companies toward more sustainable, responsible, and accountable business practices across the EU and beyond. Now that we've explored EPR and CSRD, let's turn to the third key regulation shaping EU sustainability policy, the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, or ESPR. First, what is ESPR? Effective since July 2024, Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, or ESPR, replaces the older Eco-Design Directive. But instead of focusing only on energy efficiency, ESPR sets broad sustainability standards for nearly all products sold in the EU. ESPR's main focus is on making products more sustainable by design. That includes improvements in durability, repairability, recyclability, energy performance, and overall circularity. ESPR also introduces new tools and rules. One major innovation is the Digital Product Passport, which will record key environmental and sustainability data for each product. ESPR also bans the destruction of unsold goods, pushing companies to rethink inventory and waste. How does ESPR compare to CSDDD? While CSDDD focuses on corporate conduct, supply chains, and management systems, ESPR is product-specific, setting technical standards for what companies sell, not how they operate internally. Though they're legally separate, there are clear synergies. For instance, if ESPR requires the use of recyclable materials, that decision could help a company reduce environmental risks under CSDDD. Complying with ESPR can support or even strengthen due diligence efforts. Finally, this brings us to coordination. To comply with ESPR, design and engineering teams need to be involved. But to comply with CSDDD, it's the sustainability, legal, and procurement teams that are typically in the lead. These groups must now work together because design choices affect the supply chain and vice versa. In short, ESPR is about building better products, while CSDDD is about building better business practices. Together, they reinforce the push for a more sustainable, transparent, and accountable economy. To wrap up, let's briefly summarize how CSDD connects with EPR, CSRD, and ESPR. First, these regulations are complementary, not overlapping. CSDD focuses on corporate due diligence, while EPR handles product end of life. CSRD covers reporting, and ESPR addresses product design. Each serves a distinct role, but works toward a shared sustainability goal. Second, they approach sustainability from different angles. ESPR sets design rules, EPR ensures responsible disposal, CSRD demands transparent reporting, and CSDD focuses on ethical and environmental conduct throughout the supply chain. Together, they help businesses address ESG holistically. Third, this calls for one integrated strategy. To meet EU expectations, companies must align efforts across product development, operations, and reporting. Design teams, compliance teams, and sustainability teams all need to collaborate to ensure consistent and effective compliance. In short, understanding how these regulations fit together is key to building a resilient, sustainable business. CSDDD is more than a regulation, it's a call to action. It asks companies to take real responsibility for how their products are made and how people and the planet are treated along the way. By embedding due diligence into your operations, you don't just comply, you lead. Let's move forward together with purpose, transparency, and accountability.